The most important word in the Bible is not love, it is not grace, it is not faith. It is a Hebrew imperative that has been recited more than any other sentence in the history of God's people, repeated twice every day by faithful Jews for over 3,000 years, pressed into the doorposts of homes, strapped to the foreheads of worshippers, and spoken as the final breath of the dying. It is the word Moses, placed at the center of his final address to a nation standing on the edge of the promised land. It is the word Jesus called the foundation of everything God requires. It is the word the English Bible translates as hear, and in doing so, loses half the sentence before the sentence even begins. The word is Shema, Shah, math. And the problem is not that here is wrong. The problem is that here is far too small. In 21st century English, hearing is what happens when sound waves reach your eardrums. You can hear a sermon and forget it by lunchtime. You can hear a warning and walk into the danger anyway. You can hear a voice you love and never answer. In the world of the English language, the ears and the will live in separate houses. In the world of the Hebrew Bible, they live in the same body. That is the argument of this video. Shema does not mean to receive sound. Shema means to receive what the sound demands, to take in, absorb, understand, and obey as a single act. Biblical Hebrew has no separate verb for obedience. There is no word that means only to comply or to submit to a command. When God calls Israel to obey his voice, the verb he uses is Shema. When Israel fails to obey, the text says they did not Shema. English requires two words, hear and obey, to express what Hebrew says with one. And when we translate Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 as hear, O Israel, we have technically given a correct English word for a Hebrew verb whose meaning we have not yet translated at all. That gap is the crisis of the passage, and it has been open in Western Christianity for a long time. Here is where the word lives. Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. The verse Jews call the Shema, named for the imperative that opens it. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. 6 Hebrew words. The most important sentence in Judaism. The opening of every synagogue service. The content of the phylacteries Jews bound to their arms and foreheads. The text inscribed in every mezuzah, on every doorpost, in every Jewish home. Recited morning and evening, every day, for as long as Israel has existed as a worshiping people. Moses speaks this sentence on the plains of Moab. He is 120 years old. He will not cross the Jordan. The generation he is addressing was not present at Sinai. They were children then, or not yet born. Moses is not issuing new commandments in this moment. He is handing on the covenant to people who must carry it into territory he will never enter. And the first word out of his mouth is a command. Shema is not a description. It is not a theological proposition about the nature of God, though it contains one. It is a grammatical imperative, what Hebrew calls a call second-person singular imperative of the root shin mem ayin. It means, you are being told to do something right now. The sentence does not begin with a declaration. It begins with a demand. Before Moses says anything about who God is, he orders Israel to perform an action. That order is Shema. Strong's entry 8085 defines Shema as to hear intelligently, often with the implication of attention, obedience. The Brown-Driver-Briggs lexicon lists the semantic range this way: to hear, to listen intently, to perceive, to understand, to consent, to obey. Notice the trajectory. The word does not stop at the eardrum. It moves from the ear through the mind and out into the will. Hearing that does not reach the will has not yet shamad anything. BDB lists over a dozen shades of meaning for this single root, and the common thread across all of them is not passive reception. It is active, consequential engagement with what has been said. Lois Teverberg, in her work on first century Jewish language and Jesus' teaching context, notes that biblical Hebrew carries only around 8,000 distinct words, a fraction of the vocabulary English uses. Each word is, as she puts it, an overstuffed suitcase, carrying what multiple English words would need to carry separately. Shema is one of those words. It contains listen, understand, respond, and obey in a single three-letter root. To translate it as only hear is to open the suitcase and take out one item. The Targum Onkelos, the ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah used in synagogue alongside the Hebrew text, recognize this. In Targum Onkelos, the Hebrew Shema is frequently rendered with the Aramaic kabel, ka, bel, to receive, to accept. In Deuteronomy alone, over half of the 80-odd occurrences of the Shema root are translated with this verb of active reception. Kabel means more than to hear. It means to take something in and take responsibility for it. The Targumist heard in Shema not merely an auditory event, but a covenantal posture. Open hands, not just open ears. Now here is the interpretive position I want to defend, and I hold it with conviction. The Western Christian Church has largely read Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 as a doctrinal statement, a proposition about divine unity, followed by a devotional command in verse 5 to love God with all your being. The sentence structure encourages this. First the declaration, then the response. But Moses does not begin with the declaration. He begins with the imperative. And the imperative is not a polite call to attention. It is an order that carries the entire weight of the covenant inside it. When Moses says Shema, he is not saying, please pay attention to this important announcement. He is saying, your relationship to what I am about to speak will be measured not by whether you understood it, but by whether you did it. In the theological world Moses inhabits, reception without action is not reception. It is the performance of reception. And Israel's history has proven that the performance of reception can run for centuries, while the actuality of obedience does not. The prophets understand this. Isaiah hears God say in Isaiah 1 verse 2 that he has nourished and raised children who have rebelled against him. And the verb for rebellion stands in direct contrast to Shema. They heard the covenant every morning and every evening, and did not Shema it. Jeremiah 7 verse 24 says, the people did not listen or incline their ear. The Hebrew there is Shema. Jeremiah 11 verse 8 says, none of them listened, none of them obeyed. Again, Shema. The English Bible uses two different verbs to translate what the Hebrew says with one, and in doing so, makes failure look like a hearing problem when it is actually a Shema problem. Israel was not deaf. Israel heard the words. Israel did not Shema. Think of it this way. An orchestra tunes to the same note before a performance. Every musician in the hall hears the tuning A from the oboe, but only the musicians who then adjust their instruments to match it have actually done anything with what they heard. Everyone in the building received the sound. Only the musicians responded to it. If you sat in the back row, you heard the note perfectly, but you did not obey it because the note was not commanding you. It was commanding the musicians who had committed to play together. The Shema is the tuning note of the covenant. Israel does not merely hear it. Israel is expected to tune everything. Heart, soul, will, daily practice, home, children, waking and sleeping, to the God it declares. That is what Deuteronomy 6, verse 5 to 9 goes on to specify. The Shema is followed immediately by the command to love God with everything, to teach these words to your children, to talk of them when you sit and when you walk and when you lie down and when you rise, to bind them on your hand and between your eyes, to write them on the doorposts of your house. None of that is decoration. It is the concrete embodiment of what Shema actually means. Every mezuzah on every doorpost is a visible answer to the question, did you Shema? Before going further into the word itself, I want to name what this passage is not. There is a way of reading Deuteronomy 6 that turns Shema into a merit system, as if the covenant relationship with God is earned through the quality and consistency of the hearing obedience response. That would be a serious misreading. Moses is not speaking to people who have no covenant yet, trying to qualify for one. He is speaking to people who already belong to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rescued from Egypt not because of their obedience, but because God heard the cry of his people and acted. The Exodus precedes Deuteronomy. Grace precedes command. The Shema is not the price of the relationship. It is the shape that life takes inside it. Alec Motyer, writing in the late 20th century on the theology of the Hebrew Scriptures, pressed this point with clarity. The call of the Torah is always response, never purchase. The covenant is established before the commands are given. Israel is asked to Shema not in order to become God's people, but because they already are. The Shema is a call to live like what you are, not a test to determine whether you are it. That matters, because the deepest failure the prophets describe is not the failure to believe in God. Israel's history is not a story of widespread atheism. The failure is living as though God said nothing that requires a response. Knowing the confession, but not inhabiting it. Holding the doctrine while walking in the opposite direction. Reciting the Shema twice a day, while the life refuses the God the Shema declares. That is the gap the word itself refuses to allow. You cannot Shema something and remain untouched by it. The root Shema appears over 1,100 times in the Hebrew Bible. That number alone should stop us. It is one of the most used verbs in the entire corpus. And yet, the English reader often does not know it, because it surfaces under so many different translations. Hear, listen, hearken, obey, regard, understand, be obedient, take heed, that its presence is invisible. Consider Exodus 19, verse 5. God says to Moses at Sinai, "If you will shemoa tishmo, my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession." The English usually reads, "If you will indeed obey my voice." But the Hebrew is literally, "If hearing you will hear." The verb is doubled for intensity. It is a grammatical structure that signals, really, truly, all the way here. And notice what God says that hearing is equivalent to. Keeping my covenant. To hear God's voice is to keep the covenant. To Shema is to be the kind of covenant people God is addressing. The equation is total. Exodus 24, verse 7 records Israel's response when Moses reads the book of the covenant to them. The English says, "We will do and we will obey." The Hebrew says, "We will do and we will Shema." Do first, then hear. Most readers assume that order is a mistake. Surely you hear and then you do. But in the Hebrew understanding, it is not reversed. It is precise. To do the covenant and to Shema it are the same act. The doing is the hearing. Jonathan Edwards, writing in the 18th century, did not have access to the Hebrew the way contemporary scholars do, but he grasped the underlying reality. In his treatise on religious affections, published in 1746, Edwards argued that true religious experience always produces what he called a holy practice, that the distinguishing mark of genuine faith is not the intensity of the interior experience, but the transformation of the life. He would have recognized immediately what Shema means, that reception without response is not reception, that a religion of the ear alone is no religion at all. Now we arrive at the sentence itself. What does the Shema actually declare? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Hebrew has no present tense verb. There is no is in the original. English supplies it as it must. The phrase reads literally, "The Lord, our God, the Lord, one." The theological debate that has surrounded this sentence for centuries turns on how to supply the missing verb and where to locate the predicate. The most natural reading in context is, "The Lord is our God, the Lord is one." But some scholars, including Jeffrey Tegay in his Jewish Publication Society Torah commentary on Deuteronomy, argue the sentence most likely means, "The Lord our God, the Lord alone." That is, the Lord is the only one who holds the place of God for Israel. Not merely that God is numerically singular, but that God alone occupies the throne of total loyalty. That reading sharpens the ethical demand considerably. If the Shema declares only that God is one in number, it remains a metaphysical proposition. If it declares that God alone is God for Israel, that nothing else is permitted to occupy that position, it becomes a covenant challenge to every rival claim on the human heart. No other master, no divided loyalty, no secondary lord. And the enlarged letters embedded in the Hebrew text push in exactly this direction. In every Torah scroll, two letters are written larger than the others. The ayin at the end of Shema and the dalet at the end of Eched. Together, those two letters spell the Hebrew word ed, witness. The Masoretic tradition encodes in the very typography of the text the understanding that every recitation of the Shema is an act of testimony. You are not merely acknowledging a fact about God. You are standing in front of creation and declaring it. You are naming the Lord as the only God in the hearing of heaven and earth. That is why Rabbi Akiva, recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, Barakot 61b, chose this word as his final utterance. The Romans were executing him. They were raking his flesh with iron combs. His students, watching in horror, asked how he could continue to recite the Shema. Akiva answered that all his life he had wondered how he would love God with all his soul. The Hebrew phrase that means even if it costs your life. Now that the moment had come, should he refuse it? He drew out the final word of the Shema, Echad, one, until his breath left him on the word. A voice from heaven, according to the Talmud, declared, "Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul departed with Echad." The point is not the mysticism. The point is what Echad meant to Akiva. At the moment of his death, he was not completing a liturgical formula. He was finishing a declaration. He was testifying, with his last breath, that the Lord alone is Lord. And that testimony cost him everything. That is what Shema looks like at its limit. Now we have to bring Jesus into this. In Mark 12, verse 28, a scribe approaches Jesus during Passion Week and asks what the greatest commandment is. The question is not trivial. The rabbis counted 613 commandments in the Torah, and there were ongoing debates among them about which was foundational. Jesus does not hesitate. He opens with Deuteronomy 6, verse 4-5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." Notice what Jesus does. He does not begin with the love command. He begins with the Shema. He quotes the imperative before he quotes the commandment it introduces. Jesus places the Shema as the foundation that makes the love command intelligible. Why love God with everything? Because God is one. Because God alone is God. Because the loyalty the covenant demands is total, undivided, and has no legitimate competitors. This is not a theological accident. It is the logic of the passage. You cannot love with all your heart something you have divided your heart among. You cannot love God with everything if God is one option among several that compete for your attention and allegiance. The oneness of God and the totality of love are not two separate ideas in this passage. They are the same idea. Shema Israel. God is one. Therefore hear and love accordingly, with the wholeness that only a single object of ultimate allegiance makes possible. Paul understands this. In 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6, writing to a congregation surrounded by Greco-Roman polytheism, he echoes the Shema directly. "For us, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." Paul takes the structure of Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, and redistributes it, assigning the title God to the Father and the title Lord to Jesus. This is not Paul departing from Jewish monotheism. Scholars like N.T. Wright have argued in his monumental work Paul and the Faithfulness of God, published in 2013, that Paul is doing something far more radical. He is including Jesus within the unique identity of the one God the Shema declares. The Shema said, "The Lord is one." Paul says, "The Lord is Jesus Christ." He is not abandoning Israel's confession. He is saying that Israel's confession has been Christologically defined by what God has done in the resurrection. That is a position I hold as the most theologically coherent reading of 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6, though it is disputed. What is not disputed is that Paul is consciously reaching for Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 and pressing it further than the original text anticipated. The Shema is not merely a Jewish confession. It is the foundation from which the apostolic writings Christology grows. There is one more place this word echoes that deserves its own weight. Jesus has a phrase he returns to throughout the Gospels. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The verb is the Greek akouo, but it carries the same covenantal freight as Shema. Jesus is not asking whether sound waves are entering the audience's ears. He is asking whether what he has said will reach the place where it would have to change something. He says it after the parable of the sower, after parables about lamps and bushels, after warnings about judgment. In every case, the phrase marks a boundary between those who receive the words as merely interesting and those who receive them as demanding a response. That is Shema, in Greek sentence structure. Jesus, whose native prayer life was shaped entirely by the Shema, recited every morning, every evening, every day of his life, is calling his audience to the same posture Moses called Israel to on the plains of Moab. The ears are not enough. The will must move. And there is this. In Matthew 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus closes with the parable of two builders. One hears his words and does them. His house stands in the storm. One hears his words and does not do them. His house falls, and great is its fall. The difference between the two builders is not exposure to the words. Both men heard. The difference is Shema. One man's hearing became obedience. The other man's hearing remained only hearing. The Sermon on the Mount ends exactly where Deuteronomy 6 begins. So what has been lost? When the English Bible prints, "Hear, O Israel," the reader often understands. Pay attention for a moment, because something important is about to be said. That is a reasonable reading of the English. It is an almost complete mistranslation of what the Hebrew demands. Shema does not call Israel to attention for a moment. It calls Israel to a permanent posture, a way of standing before God in which what he says and what you do are not separate categories. The ancient Israelite who recited the Shema twice a day was not performing a daily reminder that God exists. They were renewing, twice a day, a covenantal pledge. I will live as someone who has received this word. I will order my household, my children, my doorposts, my waking and sleeping around the reality this word declares. When the church reduces Shema to a synonym for listen carefully, it does two damaging things. First, it creates a category of Christian who believes the faith is substantially a mental exercise, a set of propositions correctly held, creeds rightly affirmed, doctrines accurately transmitted. This person has heard the gospel in the fullest cognitive sense and may be genuinely moved by it. But Shema has not happened until the hearing reshapes the life. Second, it makes obedience seem like something added to faith, an optional upgrade, a sign of extra commitment, something for serious Christians who want to go deeper. But in the world of the Hebrew Bible, obedience is not added to hearing. It is what hearing is. A hearing that does not produce its natural result, response, reorientation, compliance, has not yet happened in the biblical sense. It has only happened in the acoustic sense. Dane Ortland, in his work Gentle and Lowly, published in 2020, argues that the deepest failure of Christian spiritual life is not rebellion, but coldness, a distance from Christ that is technically orthodox, but functionally untouched. A person can hold every correct belief about God and still not have Shemad a single one of them. The beliefs are stored like furniture in a room no one enters. I want to name one more thing before I return the word to its place. Shema does not run in only one direction. The same verb that describes what Israel is called to do before God appears repeatedly in the Psalms as what the psalmist pleads for God to do toward him. Shema, my prayer. Hear my cry. In Psalm 17, verse 6, David says, I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me. Hear my words. In Daniel 9, verse 19, Daniel prays, O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. The bolded words in both cases are forms of Shema. When the covenant people cry out to God, they are calling on God to Shema them, to receive their voice, to understand their need, to respond with action. This is not metaphor. It is the symmetry of the covenant. God called Israel to Shema his voice. Israel calls on God to Shema theirs. The covenant is not a one-way command structure. It is a relationship in which both parties are asked to hear in the full responsive sense of that word. When God Shemas Israel's cry in Egypt in Exodus 2 verse 24, the Hebrew says he heard their groaning and remembered his covenant. The word carries the same covenantal weight. He did not merely receive the sound, he acted. The Exodus is what God's Shema looks like. And now the full picture assembles itself. Moses speaks to Israel on the boundary of the promised land. God has Shema'd their cries. He has acted. He has delivered them from slavery and sustained them through 40 years in the wilderness. Now he is asking them to Shema in return, to live as a people whose life answers the word they have received. Not earn the relationship, answer it. Here is what I am asking you to see. The word translated here in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 is not primarily an invitation to listen. It is a summons to live. The Shema, Shah, match is the sound of a covenant relationship being renewed between a God who has acted and a people who are being called to respond with everything they have. When Jesus walks into the temple in Jerusalem and is asked which commandment is first, he does not reach for a devotional preference or a theological favorite. He reaches for this word, this imperative, because it is the word the entire Torah is organized around. Before the love command, before any specific instruction, there is Shema. There is the demand that the people of God not merely learn about God, but live in a state of active, obedient reception to everything God has said. Shema is what distinguishes a people whose faith is in the ears from a people whose faith is in the bones. If you have heard this video, you have not yet Shema'd it. Shema begins after the ears have done their work, in the part of you that decides what the hearing will cost and whether you will pay it. 3,000 years ago, a 120-year-old man stood on the plains of Moab and gave Israel the word that would define their identity across every exile, every persecution, and every generation. He did not begin with theology. He did not begin with history. He did not begin with commandments. He began with a demand, and the demand has not changed. Shema Yisrael. Shema